Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing the next article from the Forge's series on corporate power.
Yes.
It's called When Disaster Strikes: Housing Inequality and the Rising Threat of Disaster Capitalism. This is a conversation between Andrea Portillo from Liberation in a Generation, Craige from Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, Stella Adams from Blueprint, North Carolina, and Audrey Aradanas from Miami Homes for All. This is a great conversation that focused on the different ways that housing justice work shows up in different parts of the country, and the different things that people are trying to address in those different pockets. So to open the conversation, Andrea lays out the following. Quote, "Together, we'll be discussing how corporate power has shaped and continues to shape housing and the neighborhoods and communities that they serve, and explore how long-term disinvestment and policies continue to prioritize profit over people, have empowered corporate landlords, increased pressures on local communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that impact in the aftermath of natural disasters and crises." Which is a great encapsulation of what they talk about.
Yes.
Almost like she planned it out or something. But I think that's enough introduction. We can get into it. What do you want to start with?
Yeah, I think this was another great piece in this series from our friends at The Forge and Liberation in a Generation. I'm glad they've teamed up to do this, and I'm glad that we're continuing this great series. So thanks for bringing this piece to the table.
You're welcome.
I feel like I appreciated so much about their conversation, especially about the work that they're doing in their respective communities, like you mentioned. Iris shared a bit about her work and what brought her to it, and I just really loved what she said. She said, quote, "I decided that I really wanted to look at things structurally and to think about who protects tenants, who protects low-income people, people of color, and their housing, and how do we stabilize communities. I was born in San Francisco, and it was really hard to see certain populations become smaller and smaller every year. So I wanted to turn to look structurally to start addressing these issues and these threats of displacement in the community I am from. I came to Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, and it is my dream job to work on stabilizing housing for tenants in South LA. South LA is really unique, and it's similar to the communities I was working with in San Francisco. They haven't traditionally had the opportunity to plan their cities or to take part democratically because we've been redlined and excluded from the process. Corporate power is seeing the vulnerability of our communities, and South LA has a really high increase of corporate investment. There's a really complicated balance that's happening in LA where we want to encourage building and we want to encourage development. We are pro-development, but it's hard when there are no protections for tenants that allow for the demolition of rent-stabilized housing for corporate powers to have an interest in buying what's traditionally, naturally occurring affordable housing. They are buying these units up, evicting tenants, and then selling to a developer or developing themselves. And we're seeing this turnover, especially in South LA, but it's not just South LA.
Yeah.
And, I think there's so much to take from that, but I so appreciated the questions and philosophy, if you will, that brought her to this work, that being her commitment to protecting tenants, protecting marginalized people, protecting marginalized communities, and standing up to corporations to say, let's build and let's develop, but that has to happen with community involvement and input and investment in the process, right? And, it has to not come at the expense of affordable housing, for goodness sake. And so I feel like both of those things can coexist and should coexist. And I think that's some of the great work that at least, she's doing and many of them are doing as well.
Yeah, and I think that there's a way that those things can coexist. I think we can have both, but it takes some work and some major shifts in policy.
Yes.
One of the things that Iris says a little bit after what you just shared is this. Altadena, unfortunately, as we know, suffered a horrendous fire at the beginning of this year, and thousands of units burned. And still, I checked in on the data just yesterday, and a majority of new purchases in Altadena are from LLCs and from corporate investments. And there is an effort to combat that, but it's really hard for the common person in LA and Altadena, a historically black city in Southern California, where they have higher income than people in South LA. And so there are even more vulnerabilities. And these are our community members who are being preyed on. even if you have what you think is a slightly higher income in LA, which is really vulnerable if you don't have these really, really strong foundations to stabilize people before disaster hits, corporations still just have more power and they're able to come in. And one of the things I wanted to think about with this actually gets discussed, I think, a little bit later, but I had this thought as I read through this. How could we limit LLCs from buying up property in this way?
That's a great question.
Particularly in places where we recognize that people are vulnerable, like in the wake of a fire in Altadena, or housing prices are skyrocketing.
Yes.
And why is that? Maybe it's because LLCs are buying property.
How about it?
It could be one factor.
Yes.
And it feels like something that could be an added process for purchasing property. Are you a huge LLC? Does this community want that?
Yes.
What kinds of issues might that LLC purchasing this property create? And it seems like there could be ways to regulate who is buying property through things like zoning laws that prioritize people rather than corporations, and families, and thinking about who is it that we want to have in our communities, and how do we build communities with the people who are here, and thinking about a people-centered kind of housing policy, which feels like we haven't really ever had, because in so many ways corporations rule a lot of the things that happen, and there's so much interest in how businesses are allowed to operate. That the way that people are allowed to navigate things is fairly limited in terms of these systems, at least from my perspective.
Absolutely. Well, and I think to your point as well, the questions you were asking there, like, it's also, to me, who does exist in these communities, and that's their home, and they should be allowed to return there in the wake of that disaster. Sure. And so I so appreciate what you said there, because I think you answered my question. Both of these things can coexist, but it has to be, as you say, I think brilliantly, people-centered and people-focused in the policies.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that in so many ways, my point is that they're not people-centered.
Absolutely. And so thank goodness for the organizations that these folks are working with and advocating, and all the work that they're doing. I want to talk a little bit about what Stella shared in response to Iris. So this conversation just continues, obviously. Specifically, her work to highlight the reduction in the Black population and the role of disaster capitalism in all of this down in Asheville, North Carolina. So Stella says, quote, "Between the 2000 census and the 2020 census, the Black population of Asheville went from 33% down to 7%. It's the same story, just a different coast. And what we're seeing is that this issue of disaster capitalism is magnifying already existing inequalities that low-income households face. Again, our western part of the state, Appalachia, is part of the poorest part of our state. Our Black and Latino residents and our immigrant families have been pushed out of their neighborhoods under the guise of recovery. I guess I don't need to tell you that the debris fields, the trash piles are all being moved into what were historically Black neighborhoods while recovery happens, and the buyout programs are being disproportionately given to those with greater means, while disaster recovery has become a political football here, and our folks are not benefiting from FEMA. In the past, FEMA covered between 50 to 75% of the costs of natural disasters. And in Helene, they are less than 10% of the recovery funds that have been done so far. Our state resources, our local resources have been pushed to the edge. But this, again, then allows for corporate interests to come in and exploit our communities and buy up land. When I was recently in Asheville just a couple of weeks ago, a mountain that used to be just beautiful greenery as you're riding up is now wrapped and stacked with housing all up the mountain. I've never seen that before, and I know that that's the future of my mountains, and it's really troubling. And so, here we're getting into more of that disaster capitalism talk, and I think the concept of disaster capitalism is just despicable. It's just disgusting. You have people reeling from truly horrific events, and losing their property, losing their homes, losing their livelihoods in a lot of ways. And this is on top of dealing with long-standing inequities and inequalities in life. And these people are in desperate need of help. And the help is at a fraction of what it used to be. How is that okay or right? And then, and you talked about this, corporations come in and swoop up and buy the land and buy these properties that have been vacated by marginalized communities instead of, maybe helping to keep those communities intact. Because I think in a lot of these cases, these corporations are also based in the communities that this is happening in some places. And so to me, all of it is just so wild. And I really just appreciate the conversation that they had in this piece to bring all of this to light.
Yeah, and one of the elements of this, one of the reasons why it happens is because the price of rebuilding is so much higher than I think it used to be.
Right.
And so there are these pieces of the puzzle that those individuals can't afford that anymore. And so now they're going to look at that buyout differently because they need to.
They have to.
They've got it. They can't consider anything else. And it feels like there's a lot that could be done to actually address that and keep people in their homes and neighborhoods rather than them getting pushed out.
Yeah.
And these corporations use these natural disasters and other moments to really hit fast forward on gentrification.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that has been preventing some pushback to that is the lack of home rule, or the way that states can preempt local laws with state laws that nullifies the local laws.
Right.
So Audrey talks a little bit about this after Stella shares some similar stories about North Carolina in the wake of the hurricane.
Yep.
Audrey says, I think in Florida it's quite interesting because we're just full red. And so locally, Miami-Dade, we can be quite progressive. I'm really amazed and love our tenant councils, our tenant unions, and our tenant rights groups. A few years ago, they pushed for a tenant bill of rights that passed locally, and then it got preempted at the state level. And then everyone pretty much agrees, let's protect our bay, let's protect our water, let's protect the Everglades, let's improve our homes. Our local elected officials are all about it. State came in, kind of swept a lot of that. And so there's kind of a push and pull right now between our local politics and our state politics. And this feels like the creep of authoritarianism, particularly as we know who sits in that governor's seat in Florida.
Absolutely.
One of the purposes of having local governments in cities and counties is that those governments can address local problems that may not be universal across a state.
Right.
And Miami is a great example of this because it's a densely populated urban area that is experiencing a lot of challenges with aging housing stock that Audrey talked about earlier in the article, and climate crises and flooding, which Audrey mentions again. And those things aren't the same that lots of other rural places in Florida are dealing with, or even other urban areas are dealing with in the same way.
Yep.
Because they're in different places and they've got different ecological challenges to face.
Yep.
And so for a state government like Florida to stop local governments from addressing local issues feels like a real undermining of the concept of shared governance.
Yep.
And a weird paternal instinct to say, I know better than you.
Yeah.
And it ultimately benefits corporations rather than people.
There it is.
In a lot of different ways, and benefits their agenda to say, oh, we stopped these wackos in where blah, blah, blah from doing XYZ because isn't that crazy? And that's also the kind of talking point that they serve to their base.
Yeah, the rhetoric.
That is a piece of this as well. But I think it's really just down to who's sending the money in the election funds to help them get elected again. Yeah,
and who's ultimately in charge at a place like that. Yeah, I think you're right there. And it's fascinating to think about that there are these local governments that do care and are trying to do the work that's necessary because they understand their communities, they know their people. But, in this situation, you have who sits in the governor's office swoop in and say.
Yeah, and it might not even be that they care. It's just that they see that there's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that ultimately, if you see there's a problem, you address it. There's a level of care there.
Sure.
But just being able to address a problem on your local level and then being told you can't do that by the state, there's something fundamentally wrong and authoritarian about that.
Absolutely.
That I think we have to continue to unpack as we try to shift back away from and push back against this authoritarian creep that has been going on for several decades.
Oh, I agree. I think, added to the list of things that infuriates me about the world, one of the things that also infuriates me about the state of our world, and specifically our economy right now, was encapsulated really well by something that Stella says in this conversation. So she says, quote, "And while we are fighting to raise wages, we're a right to work state. So there's no unions here, and folks are working 3 and 4 jobs. When rents for a one-bedroom go from $850 to $1,400 a month between pre- and post-pandemic, how are people supposed to live? Our seniors who are on a fixed income, if they own their land, we give them a 50% homestead tax break. And if they're renting, they can't afford to pay increased rent in rural housing. And for Audrey and me, USDA rural housing programs that provide for homes for the elderly and rural communities, those expire within the next 2 to 3 years. And they're going to kick thousands of elderly people into homelessness before 2030. It's devastating. And so for me, it's like, that's the state of the world right now. That's the goal now. And so they go on to talk about the role that our local, state, and federal governments have played in making this reality, the reality that we're in, but also how, they're optimistic about the organizing and the advocacy work that they're doing, that their organizations are doing to combat it, which is great. But it's just, to me, such an untenable thing, our economy, for all of us, but especially in these communities most impacted by disaster capitalism and communities that are people having to work 3 and 4 jobs to survive. It's really, really tough.
Yeah, and there's so many ways that the economy is, in this big picture, vague sense of the word, doing really well.
Yeah.
But people on the ground are not doing well
at all.
So that disconnect, as it continues to grow, I think that's going to create more and more issues for people day to day. That's an obvious thing to say, but I think it's also going to create more pushback that people are going to say, no, this isn't right. This isn't serving any of us.
And get to the streets, people. Let's go. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about applications before we get into the streets.
Okay.
How does this article and our conversation about it apply to our day-to-day lives and work? My application is the creativity in addressing these problems about housing inequality and housing justice. They talk later in the article about how there are some land trusts that are being built by churches, which create affordable housing units with the land that they own. And then Iris talked about a workshop series that they did to educate their members on disaster capitalism and what kind of models they could use to protect themselves in that situation. And there are some smaller landlords who are out there who are looking into shared ownership models to keep their properties out of the hands of large corporate landlords. Maybe they own a small building or something.
Yep.
And instead of just putting it up for sale, they'll try to sell it to the tenants.
Right.
So that it's tenant owned, or they'll look into other models like that rather than selling to a corporate landlord who might buy it, evict people, tear it down, and redevelop.
Corporate be
luxury.
corporate. Yep.
Yeah. And so that's another element that I think, as we think about who's in the work, often I don't think about landlords being a part of that solution.
Yes.
But I think about a mom and pop group that has a couple of buildings and a house here or there. Those people aren't the ones who are creating the issues in the same way that large corporate organizations are. So that's an interesting thing to think about too, as people are small groups are selling their property. How do they not sell it to corporate landlords?
Yeah.
And that being a piece of the puzzle, I think, is interesting work for these kinds of organizations that we're having this conversation to do.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of different things that people are doing across the country that could inform different approaches in different places that meet the needs of those places.
Absolutely. I love that idea of what creative solutions are being employed in these places, and how can that be applied more broadly. That's great. My application comes from the towards the end of their conversation. Each of the folks in this interview talk about what's giving them hope in the work that they're doing and around fighting against disaster capitalism and fighting for housing justice. And I so appreciated what all of them shared, but something about what Stella Adams says just hit me in my heart. So she said, quote, "I get hope from watching communities take stands for themselves. I've not seen a community that's just taken it, just acquiesced to this. People are fighting these corporate entities. They're fighting against this disaster capitalism. They are trying to keep their communities, keep their culture, keep affordability. Housing is so fundamental because houses become homes, and homes are fundamental to who we are as human beings. It doesn't matter whether we're living in a mansion or we're living in a shotgun shack. It's our home, and we value it, and we want to preserve and protect it. And we want the opportunity for home ownership. But we also want to have a roof over our head that we can afford, where we can live and thrive. And I see people advocating on a daily basis in their communities for their communities. I see tenants in public housing fighting to get the housing authorities to do right by them. I see teachers and firefighters struggling to protect our communities, protect our health, but they need us. They're worried about whether they have a roof over their heads at home. And so I have hope that we as advocates will be working in tandem with people in the communities to bring this to the attention of those who can make the changes, which are the politicians at the local, state, and federal level. And so, yeah, I just loved that. And in so many ways, the fight here is for basic human rights and dignity. But the notion of a house being a home and that home being core to who we are as humans and how that's an access point for community is just a beautiful thing. And it's absolutely worth fighting for. And so kudos to the folks in this piece for the work that they're doing. And that just hit home for me.
Yeah, I thought that was a great, that her particular section, that stood out to me as well. All right, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today? I think continuing to read the series from The Forge is great homework. I'm really appreciating the way that they're diving into all these aspects of corporate power. I don't know that I would have thought about housing as an immediate piece of that puzzle, but having read this, it feels very obvious. And even as I say it, I'm like, well, yeah, duh. My other homework is to check out some of these organizations that are represented in this conversation, like Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, Blueprint North Carolina, and Miami Homes for All, because they all seem like they're doing good work. And there were references to different reports and different things that they released. So it would be great to check out some more about what they're doing.
Yeah.
What about you?
I'm going to just co-sign all of that. I think, since you brought this piece of the table, I guess I'm up next. So I'm going to have to look to see what the next piece in this series should be that we'll bring to the table and when that'll be. So stay tuned for that. So I co-sign that. And I also definitely want to learn more about these organizations and the great work that they're doing in their communities. Because I think, as you said, what are the creative solutions that are out there? What's working? And how can we apply that in all of the places that we are at? So, yeah, I completely co-sign that homework.
All right, great. Well, that's it for our conversation today about this article about housing inequality in The Forge. And Damien, you're up next time.
Yeah.
What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Well, how about we go from one series to another?
Okay.
All right. Our friends over at Inquest have put together a few pieces into a series that they are calling Carceral AI.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And so I'm going to bring one of the pieces from earlier this year to the table for us. The piece is called Carceral AI is Here. It's Time to Fight Back. And it was written by Dasha Pruss. And Inquest actually describes their entire Carceral AI series by saying this. Quote, today, incarcerated people in some facilities are being forced to wear hard plastic bracelets that transmit their live biometric data to the state. At the same time, algorithm-driven technologies are being used to predict who might commit a crime, to detain immigrants and identify sites for ICE raids, and to jail Black people misidentified by facial recognition systems. It has become increasingly clear that we need a term for the insidious ways artificial intelligence is being used to criminalize society's most vulnerable while surveilling the rest of us on a daily basis and generating billions of dollars in the process. Carceral AI, a term coined by researcher Dasha Pruss and a team of interdisciplinary scholars, captures this phenomenon. Pruss's research serves as both the inspiration for and first installment in our own Carceral AI series, which will address an array of topics ranging from AI-driven facial misrecognition to efforts to use AI to justify the revival of so-called predictive policing. So, yeah, I read that and I was like, yeah, that's it. We've got to read this. So I'm looking forward to reading this first piece by Dasha and talking about it with you next time.
Yeah, me too. One, it sounds like the predictive policing part sounds like Minority Report, that movie from 2004 or 5 or something.
That Tom Cruise?
Yeah. So one, which was a dystopian thing, like it was, what?
Yeah. Here we are.
There's that one piece. And then it also makes you think about some of the ways that AI surveillance is being used in our schools and our local school board buying a subscription for a surveillance AI tool that they're going to potentially implement next year. I'm not quite sure about the ins and outs of it.
Okay.
But I found a candidate for, and by found, I mean he walked up to me at my house as I was mowing my yard and talked to him about it. He said, oh yeah, I'm against that. And I said, well, you've got my vote, sir.
Absolutely.
So lots of different pieces on how this is hitting close to home for me in particular, but us like living here in this particular area outside of Washington, D.C. There's so much of all of this happening with all of the agencies just down the street. We talk about flock cameras, all of these different pieces of surveillance technology that police departments have been implementing across the country. Are all tied into how this is going to be implemented. And so I'm excited to see more of an infrastructure or framework around what carceral AI looks like and learn from Dasha as well. So
and how we fight against it. Absolutely. No, I thought you'd be excited about it too.
Yeah.
So very good.
All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.